Hi everyone. In this lecture, we are going to start the first chapter titled Market Failures. There are multiple sources of market failures in economics, and for this first lecture, we are going to go over market power. First, I want to point out that these notes are partly based on a book called The Economy, published by the Core. Units 7.10 and 7.11 in particular were used to make those lecture notes, as well as SFU professor Anke Kessler's notes. However, I am entirely responsible for any error, and I do not legally allow this content to be published without my consent. In the last lecture, we saw a model of perfect competition, and we also saw that the competitive equilibrium is Pareto efficient. The competitive equilibrium is an allocation that describes who gets what. And at this equilibrium, there is no other allocation that makes somebody better off without making someone else worse off. So this is kind of a benchmark, right? And in particular, perfect competition requires that firms set a price equal to their marginal cost. The marginal cost is the cost of producing one extra unit of the good. Perfect competition is a benchmark that barely exists in reality, because in general, firms manage to charge a price above the marginal cost and generate positive profits, as in they make money on top of paying all of the costs required to produce the good. They still make a positive profit and sell a positive quantity by charging a price above the marginal cost. So, market power is the cause of that market failure. And in particular, market power is related to the notion of marginal cost. It is the ability to charge a price above the marginal cost. In perfect competition, where price is equal to marginal cost, this condition corresponds to the fact that producing one extra unit would cost more to the firm than the money it would make by selling that unit. So this extra unit should not be produced. On the other hand, if producing one extra unit of the good costs less than the money that it brings, then that unit should be produced in order to make more profits. There comes a point where the marginal cost will be equal to the price, as in one extra unit of the good will cost as much as the money it brings to the table. And this is the condition we have for perfect competition. So the outline for today will be to talk about different forms of market power and explain why every time there will be some kind of a market failure. I will start with the case of a monopoly. Then I will move away from monopoly and talk about competition between firms that produce a differentiated product. Then I will link this idea of differentiated products with the purpose of advertising. And finally, I will talk about firms which are supposed to compete, but instead they decide to cooperate in some way, and we call this collusion. First, let's go with monopoly. A firm is said to be a monopolist or is in a monopoly if it is the only firm in the market and no other firm produces the same good or a close substitute for it. That is an important condition here. If a firm produces a close substitute to the good, then this firm said to be a monopolist will still face competition because consumers could always buy this substitute, which means they could buy a good that satisfies the same purpose as the one the monopolist makes. But in this case, the optimal decision will be slightly different, and this is what we will see in the differentiated products case. In the real world, there are only a few pure monopolies, as in only one firm on a specific market. We will assume that a monopoly faces a downward sloping demand, which means when the price is high, the quantity sold will be low. This assumption makes sense for most goods. You might think of some exception, maybe some luxury goods like jewels, or maybe some goods like pieces of art. A high price might signal a high quality or a high value for a piece of art, and for that reason, there might be a higher demand for pieces that are priced higher. I will not take into account these assumptions today. I will not take into account these specific goods. The idea of a monopolist is that it will not lose all of its demand when it raises a price above the marginal cost. Why? Because this is the only firm on the market. So, by raising the price above the marginal cost, it will still find consumers willing to pay that price. Hence, a monopolist has market power. Now, monopolies can come from different sources. First of all, the government could allow the existence of monopolies. It could regulate or own a firm. In particular, this is something we see in the market for utilities, such as gas, water, electricity, sometimes transportation. Or it could allow some firms to operate as a monopolist through patents. For instance, pharmaceutical companies who come up with new drugs and vaccines might get the exclusive right to produce that specific drug or vaccine. Governments might grant copyrights to producers of music and movies so that they are the exclusive entity that can release the movie or the music. Firms can also buy trademarks and be the only ones to be allowed to be called a certain name, a certain brand name. Or in specific markets, some firms might act as a monopolist because of licenses that they obtain from the government. For instance, nightclubs and cable providers. Sometimes monopolies arise kind of naturally due to the structure of the market, in particular when they are large efficient scales. Markets characterized by economies of scale, where the average cost decreases as the quantity produced increases, will result in having one single firm produce for the whole market. It is typically the case in utility markets, such as gas, electricity, transportation, because there are huge fixed costs associated to building a network and maintaining that network. If you think about electricity, you have a bunch of towers linked by cables, gigantic power plants, which are difficult to maintain. At the same time, they represent the same cost to maintain if you provide electricity to 100 people versus 1,000 people. For this reason, it is cheaper to provide electricity to 1,000 people per person than to provide electricity to 100 people. In this case, it is then more efficient, less costly for one firm to produce for the whole market as opposed to having firms compete. And this is how you find firms like BC Hydro being a monopolist regulated by the government. Building and maintaining an electricity network is costly. Hence, it is better to have one firm that has such network to build and maintain than having two firms with a network each and at the same time competing with each other. We call this natural monopolies. Sometimes, large efficient scale can arise from network externalities, in particular on the demand side. There are some types of goods which are more interesting to consume when other consumers are already buying and consuming it. For instance, Dragon Ball trading cards or any type of trading cards really. I'm sure that when you were kids, some people in your school had trading cards, Dragon Ball, Pokemon, or anything else. Well, if only one person in the school is having trading cards, then it will not be very interesting for you to buy trading cards. However, if everybody in the school has some already, then it will be interesting for you to get some. So, the more users there are of that good, then the more interesting it is for non-users to acquire it. In the case of software, it is also possible. Think about Microsoft Office, the package that contains Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Access, and maybe one or two other softwares that I'm not aware of. If a lot of your colleagues already use it and you're working in a team, chances are you will have to use it as well. So it will be more interesting for you to acquire it and learn how to use it. So the more users of this software they are, the more interesting it will be for you to get it as well. Social media is a typical example of it. Twitter, but also Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube are also cases where the more users there are on the platform, the more interesting it is for non-users to start using the platform. If Twitter only had 100 users, it would not be that interesting, and pretty much nobody else would come to the platform. A lot of people who might not have made an account yet might eventually make an account once they realize that maybe everything happens on Twitter. Same for Instagram, same for TikTok. So these firms, if they manage to get a strong network of users from the get-go, will get a head start and will be able to grow an even bigger network, because the more people they are in the network, the more interesting it is to join that network. Think about YouTube. YouTube was created in 2005. I remember discovering YouTube back in 2005. I had the internet for maybe 1 year at home, and back then there were two other platforms that were proposing videos. There was Google Video, which I don't even know if it still exists, and another platform that was French called Dailymotion. You can take a look at it online. It is pretty quiet these days, but back then it was a solid competitor to YouTube. YouTube eventually managed to grow a strong network of users, especially by proposing very interesting compensation packages, monetization through ad revenues, sponsorships, and so on. That eventually, if you wanted to watch video, probably you would have to go through YouTube. Finally, some firms might end up in a monopoly state just because they are competing well with other firms. Some firms might be more cost efficient, or others might actually control what is needed to produce the good. For instance, De Beers is a cartel, is a big company that used to own between, I believe, 70 and 80% of the diamond resources in the world. If you own most of the diamond in the world, then you pretty much own its production. And then you're pretty much a monopolist in that industry. Nowadays, De Beers, I believe, owns between 50 and 60% of the world diamond production. So they are not that big of a monopoly anymore, but they are still the biggest group in that market. Other firms just are good at competing with other firms and being more cost efficient, manage to maybe drive other firms out of the market, or they might be able to prevent entry of firms into this market by, for instance, proposing lower prices until other firms cannot follow anymore. Now, the two examples I'm giving you here are not pure monopolies, but they are they cover more than 50% of their market share in their respective markets. Walmart, maybe not in Canada, but in the US, is definitely the leader in the retail industry. There are still competitors like Safeway, Save-On, Whole Foods, Superstore, and so on. But it is still the biggest on the market there. Microsoft is the leader in the operating system market. Of course, you might think of Apple as being the second leader, and yes, it is a big leader, something between 20 and 30% of the market shares, I believe. Microsoft stays the leader and was able to do so by proposing very attractive prices for a very long time. Of course, there's probably a small percentage, maybe 1%, 0.1% of Linux users. But Linux being free, I don't even know if we can count them as being part of the market. Now, monopolies, like any other firm, will maximize their profits. Turns out that when you look at the model of profit maximization for a monopoly, monopolies maximize their profits by charging a price above the marginal cost, in general way higher than the marginal cost, even if it means selling less. So they make more profit by charging a high price and selling a lower quantity than in competition. How high should the price be? This will depend on the demand, of course. And in fact, it will depend on how elastic the demand for the good is. A quick refresher about what elasticity means. The price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in the demand when the price increases by 1%. So you increase the price by 1% and you see how much the quantity consumed increases or decreases. You can imagine that when the price increases, we will see a demand decrease. So let's try to use our intuition to understand how this relates to high prices or low prices. If the demand is elastic, it means it reacts a lot to a price increase. As soon as the price increases a bit, then consumption drops. In this case, the monopolist cannot charge a too high of a price because the quantity sold would decrease too much and they would lose profits. On the other hand, if the demand is inelastic, it means it reacts very little when the price increases. So when the price increases, the quantity consumed barely changes, stays pretty steady. So the monopolist can charge a higher price without the fear of seeing the quantity drop. Typical goods where the demand is pretty inelastic, we find tobacco, gasoline, alcohol, basic goods. For instance, I'm pretty sure that in China, rice would have a pretty inelastic demand because it is used every day in almost every meal. The same way bread in France would have a pretty inelastic demand. If the price increases by a couple cents, or maybe 20, 30 cents, that would represent maybe a percent change, a percent increase, people will still consume as much bread as before. Other markets might have a very elastic demand. You might think of markets which are mainly covered where the demand is mainly composed of students. Students in general tend to be rather poor. So they tend to eat basic goods. They don't go out too much because it gets expensive very quickly. And they will not spend a lot of money in the goods they buy. Maybe except for specific cases like phones or laptops and so on, where they might need some technology. So a monopolist might be the only producer of a good, might have market power because it's the only producer of the good. However, it will not be able to do whatever it wants, and it will all depend on the structure of the demand. Now, in general, the price will be higher than the marginal cost. And this leads to what we call a deadweight loss. This is a surplus that was lost in the case of a monopoly that used to be part of the consumer surplus under the competitive equilibrium. This chunk of surplus is lost. The monopolist is, of course, better off. Profits are higher when they are the only ones to produce on the market. So their own surplus will be higher. This is profit. But the consumer surplus will be smaller. They will be worse off. Why? Well, because the price is higher, so they consume a lower quantity. So their blue triangle will shrink. Now we say that the outcome is inefficient. And going back to the definition of Pareto efficiency, it means that we should find an allocation that makes somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. Here, the firm could sell extra units of the good at a lower price. They would find some consumers willing to pay this lower price, and this lower price could still be higher than the marginal cost, so the firm itself would make extra profits. However, here we are talking about only one price on the market, a uniform price. So they cannot charge $5 until they get to a certain quantity and then start charging $4. This would be a case of price discrimination, something you're going to see in a future tutorial, but it is not something that happens when the price is uniform. So, in fact, there is an allocation that would make some consumers better off, the ones who were not buying before, the price was too high, but if they have to pay a slightly lower price, they might be willing to pay, and the firm would still be able to make extra profits. Since this allocation is not reached, then the monopoly outcome is inefficient. Now, let's move away from a monopoly and let's go back to a case where firms are competing. However, this time, the good they produce is not the same, is not homogeneous. So, although some firms are the only ones to produce a given good, the existence of goods which are similar but not exactly the same will still be a threat to their profits. And in fact, most markets are characterized by differentiated products. For instance, think about the car market. Ford versus Chevrolet versus Honda versus Hyundai versus Renault in France, and so on. All of them make cars. They have the same purpose. They are substitutes, but the cars are not exactly the same. The shape, the color, the hardware, and so on. In the soft drink markets, Pepsi Cola competes with Coca-Cola. For many, there might be a difference in the taste. However, they are pretty close substitutes. So, when markets have differentiated products, and those firms with differentiated products manage to survive and live? It reflects the fact that consumers have different preferences, different tastes for different cars. Some people might like a Jaguar, some other people might prefer Ford, and so on. There are some people who prefer Pepsi-Cola to Coca-Cola, and vice versa. So, to each product, its own demand. The price, however, is going to influence the demand for the other good. Here's an example. I might prefer Coca-Cola to Pepsi-Cola. In reality, it's not true. I can't even tell the difference in the taste. But imagine that I do prefer Coca-Cola. But Coca-Cola is twice as expensive as Pepsi-Cola. Well, if it's that expensive, I might prefer to buy something close to it, even though the taste is not exactly the same. And I will go for Pepsi-Cola. Same the other way around. If I prefer Pepsi-Cola, but the price of Pepsi-Cola is too high, then I will switch to Coca-Cola. So here, firms are technically the only ones to produce their own good, but because they are close substitutes to this good, we cannot really call them monopolists. In fact, there is another term for it. It's called monopolistic competition. Everybody makes their own thing, but they're so close that they're still competing. Now, because each product has its own demand, firms will exploit the different elasticities, again, to be able to charge a price above the marginal cost. Some firms might face a more or less elastic or inelastic demand, depending on the product, and they might be able to leverage that elasticity to increase their profits through a higher price. For instance, I am pretty sure that the demand for Apple products is more inelastic than the demand for Microsoft products. So if the price increases a bit for a Mac, I think people will still buy a Mac. People who already are convinced that Macs are better, who actually prefer Macs, the brand, Apple, will still buy the good, whereas maybe firms, maybe consumers who are facing a price increase in Microsoft products might decide to not buy a Microsoft product, and they might wait or buy something cheap. I'm pretty sure, actually, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm pretty sure that people who like Coca-Cola over Pepsi-Cola will be willing to pay a way higher price for a Coca-Cola product, and even if the price of Coca-Cola increases by 1%, they will still go for Coca-Cola. I seem to know more people who prefer Coca-Cola over Pepsi-Cola, so I know more fans of Coca-Cola than I know fans of Pepsi-Cola. This is what I mean. Now, when you produce your own good, you want to distinguish yourself from the rest of the pack. You kind of want to convince your consumers that what you're making doesn't have a substitute. You kind of want to tell, yeah, but it's very different from what other people do. If you make phones, for instance, smartphones, you kind of want to convince your consumers that the phones you make are very different from the phones that other brands make, so that people feel that they will get needs fulfilled by that phone that no other phone will fulfill. And this, most of the time, is achieved through advertising. Firms can gain market power by influencing the demand. This is usually what advertising is about. Most of the time, it is about convincing them. Sometimes, it is about just providing information about the product. Think about a car, for instance. Very often, they give you a bunch of specs about the consumption of gasoline, the power in horses, the is it a hybrid? What kind of system is it? The cylinders, and so on and so forth. But if you look at an advertising, like a billboard, you will also find a picture of the car in front of a sunset, in front of a sunrise, in the mountain, by the beach, and so on. And this play on the aesthetics is a way to also persuade you to buy the car. Look at how good it looks. Don't you want to be in it? And so, most of the time, advertising has this persuasive function. The point is to increase the willingness to pay of consumers, to make the demand more inelastic, so they can charge a higher price, or to create brand loyalty. I can give you a couple of examples. George Clooney has been on a long streak of commercials with Nespresso. The point is to make us believe somehow that because George Clooney is in it, that must be good stuff. So we should buy the Nespresso machine, we should buy the Nespresso capsules, and so on and so forth. Brad Pitt has been seen in a commercial for Chanel No. 5, which is a perfume that originally targets the female audience. So why would Brad Pitt be the only one to be in the commercial? Yet he is. And in the social media sphere, influencers nowadays are sponsored by brands. You can think about fitness influencers, which are sponsored by big brands like Gymshark. You might have heard of it. They make t-shirts, shorts, pants, sweaters, pretty much apparel for fitness and bodybuilding. Supplement companies also sponsor some athletes, some influencers, most of the time influencers, so that the influencers are going to advertise the product and say, buy the protein powder from there, check the Gymshark new collection that came out, I'm going to give you a discount code. Well, the discount code is not just a way to get a 10% discount, it's also a way for the influencer to get paid by the sponsor. When you buy a sweater from Gymshark and you use a discount code from somebody you know, then Gymshark will see what discount code you used and will pay the influencer a certain percentage according to the sales. Makeup influencers who test different brands of makeup and sometimes give advice for or against certain brands will often receive a package, a box of samples from a brand, and the brand will pay the influencer to say good things about the brand. The influencer might not even care about the brand itself and might not even use this brand on a daily basis. But it could be a nice offer so that you might hear influencers say, buy this brand, it's a very good brand, I use it every day. How do we know that? In the gaming sphere, a lot of gamers and streamers at a competitive level or just at the streaming level on Twitch are sponsored by hardware companies. Asus sponsors a lot of gamers and streamers with their laptops. You have hard drive companies, mouse and keyboard companies, gaming chair companies, and so on and so forth. It is one but many ways to get customers used to seeing a certain brand and to automatically think about that brand when they think about, oh, I'm going to buy a gaming chair. Well, I've seen so many people use this brand. First thing they're going to do, they're going to go to the website of that brand in particular. And you might think, well, advertising doesn't work on me. It works on everybody, but on different levels. It's not because I see a commercial on TV that I'm going to buy from that brand right away. But seeing some commercials on TV might teach me, I might learn something about a specific product that has a specific purpose. For instance, if one day I need a cleaning product, I might think, well, I'm just going to go to the store and see different brands of cleaning products. But if I see a commercial with Mr. Clean every other day for a couple months, then whenever I need to go buy cleaning products, I will think, well, there is Mr. Clean among others. And I might give more attention to Mr. Clean. I might look at the product in more details than the others. That is already a job that is well done for the commercial. One thing I learned recently that I think is worth mentioning is that in movies, Apple pays or sponsors studios to include some Apple products, iPhones, Macs, or maybe iPods. But they specifically require that no villain, no bad character uses an Apple product. And second, that the Apple products are the most visible when the hero is in a phase where he's developing himself. In many action movies or something, superhero movies, the hero eventually loses a master figure of some sort, then he gets a bit depressed, and eventually gets motivated, trains back, and finally defeats the bad guy after maybe a second fight or something like a second confrontation. If you pay attention, you might see that it's precisely during that period where he's picking himself up, he's getting progress, he's training and so on, that you will see him use a Mac or an iPhone or any other Apple product. You will never see a bad guy use an Apple product. On the other hand, Dell is way less picky about how the product is going to show up in movies. And this is how you're going to see so many hackers and bad guys use Dell products, maybe Dell laptops and computers, and the good guys will be using Apple products. Again, it is to, I guess, subconsciously create this image that Apple product is for the good people, the ones who are picking themselves up, improving themselves, developing themselves, and not for sneaky or bad purposes. Marketing goes very far sometimes. It is a fascinating topic that unfortunately we do not teach in the economics program at SFU, but this is a fascinating topic that goes very, very deep into the human brain, what activates the good parts of the human brain, what activates the rewards, what activates the pleasure hormones, and so on. Now, aside from advertising, I want to go back to the case where firms compete. When only a handful of firms are in a market, we talk about an oligopoly. The term oligo, the prefix oligo, I believe in Greek or maybe in Latin, means several, multiple. The same way mono means one for monopoly, and duo would mean two for duopoly. I don't know if the term triopoly really exists. I don't think it's really used. In oligopolies, they are a handful of firms, so competition exists, but it is not fierce necessarily. So firms each have market power, but they face competition at the same time. Because of that, they have an incentive to cooperate, and this is what we call collusion. Collusion is a situation where firms coordinate or cooperate on a market. This can be done explicitly. A firm calls another firm and says, hey, let's keep the prices high, let's not compete too hard with each other. We are the only 2, 3, 4 firms on the market. Let's keep prices fairly high so consumers will have no alternative. They will have to buy from one of us. And let's share the profits. Or it could be done in a less obvious way, in a more subtle way, where firms are observing each other on the market. They don't explicitly communicate, but they can look at what the other firm is doing and align their prices with them. They charge this much, I will charge roughly the same price. I will not try to compete. Since we are the only ones producing, let's keep all of our prices high so that consumers will have no other choice but consume from one of us. So in this case, what they want to do is actually behave together like a monopolist. High price, even if it means lower quantities, that doesn't matter. The more firms there are in a market, the more difficult it is to cooperate with everybody, because you need to reach an agreement with more and more parties. I will talk about this a bit more in the first problem set. Collusion is illegal, and firms are subject to fine if they get caught. In fact, every country has a competition board, an antitrust organization that focuses on making sure that markets are competitive to some extent. They conduct investigations about markets on a regular basis and build cases to check whether these firms seem to be cooperating, and if they do, then they get fined and punished in sometimes other ways. Here are a couple of examples. In the European Union, the gas industry was subject to a collusion case back, I believe, in 2008. I don't remember exactly. And you can find the link here to the case, where I believe two firms that were providing gas to the rest of the European countries were coordinating on the prices they were charging to each country. They got caught and they got fined for several hundreds of millions of dollars, euros. That's a lot. They usually get fined for up to how much profit they managed to generate during the collusion period. So let's say they collude for 5 years. That's a lot of profits made when you're one of the biggest producers of and provider of gas in the European Union. So in fact, I'm not even sure a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars is a lot for these firms. Interestingly, another funny example I found was the shrimp market. I believe this happened in Denmark and maybe Sweden, Finland, and Norway, some Scandinavian countries, where fisheries were coordinating on the price of shrimps. They were keeping prices very high as if the supply was low, but that was not the case. Two firms in the car glass market. I believe one firm was German, the other is French. Got caught for cooperating in the price they charge for the glass they produce for cars, for windows and the windshield. Finally, I want to talk about a case that I personally know about. I lived during that case, and this is something I paid for back then. This happened in the wireless service provider companies in France. So in Canada we have cont'd, Fido, Bell, AT&T, Freedom Mobile, Virgin Mobile, and Charter. Those are the only ones I know personally. In France back then, around 2005-2006, there were only 3 providers: SFR, Orange, and Bouygues Telecom. They were charging high prices and almost the same prices for almost the same package. I remember they had a package for 30 euros that was containing a certain amount of texts and a certain amount of calls, like minutes for calls. Nothing was unlimited yet, I believe. 30 euros was a bit expensive for that. And I believe that between SFR, Orange, and Bouygues Telecom, the packages were almost exactly the same. There wasn't data yet back then. Smartphones were not out yet, I believe. And these firms eventually got caught and they got fined huge amounts. I believe we talk about 200 million euros for SFR and Orange, and something like 58 million euros for Bouygues Telecom. You can find the numbers online. What the government did as well was allow a fourth firm to enter the market and compete. This firm is called Free. It was a firm that was providing internet connection, and eventually they also opened their services to phone providers, and they showed up with a package, I think, that was costing something like €5, and you had either unlimited texts or unlimited calls for €5. And I believe for maybe 10 or 15 euros, you had unlimited both text and calls. So as soon as this package came out, SFR, Orange, and Bouygues had to align themselves, and they had to lower the prices. Nowadays, the telecom market in France has lower prices, is way less expensive than it is in Canada. So, in this lecture overall, I went through different reasons why there might be market power. I explained, in particular in the monopoly case, but it's the case everywhere, that a market failure means there is a deadweight loss. The outcome is inefficient, which means we can find another allocation that would make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. Always back to the definition. I first talk about the monopolist. The only firm on the market can use that to propose a price higher than the marginal cost. Now, how much higher will depend on how elastic the demand is. So a monopolist stays disciplined by the demand. Then I talked about the fact that even if there is competition, the product sold might not be exactly the same. And because of that, firms face their own demand, and they can use that to propose a price above the marginal cost. They still have to pay attention to their competitors. Another example I forgot to mention, which is in the slides, is think about campus. Tim Hortons and Starbucks are located in the same building. They both propose coffee and tea and other beverages. The coffees and the teas have different tastes, they have different origins, the packaging got different colors, different sizes, and so on. But at the end of the day, if you want coffee, you can get a coffee at Tim Hortons or Starbucks. They are substitutes to some extent. Now I know some people really prefer Starbucks coffee, so they only purchase from Starbucks, and they're willing to pay a higher price. Others prefer Tim Hortons coffee, either because of the taste or because it is cheaper. But each of these companies are paying attention to what the neighbor is doing, because this will affect how much people will come to their store. A way to increase this distinction between the good of a firm and a substitute is to invest in advertising. You might be able to charge a price way higher than the marginal cost than a competitor, because maybe you have more of a fan base, you have a more solid core of consumers for your brand than your competitor. Advertising can help you increase demand, increase willingness to pay, maybe make demand more inelastic, and then this way the firm can gain more market power. Finally, there are some markets where only a couple of firms are operating. They could produce differentiated products or not, but if there are only a couple of them, they might want to collude. They might want to cooperate with each other. They might want to charge a high price altogether, coordinate on that, so that consumers have no other choice than pay this high price from one of these firms. Profits will stay high. However, this is illegal, and firms can be subject to huge fines if they get caught. That's it for this lecture on the first type of market failure we will see in this course, market power. We will see a bunch in the following weeks. In the meantime, have a good rest of your week and see you in the next one.